Before we get too far into the idea of reinforcement, there's some basic terms that we need to go through. The first term is positive reinforcement. Positive reinforcement is the delivery of a stimulus based on a response which works to increase the probability that the response will occur again in the future. Now, what does that mean to the typical person? In plain language, that means the student does something, the teacher gives the student something. It could be an object, an activity, attention, etc., that the student likes, and therefore the student is likely to respond the same way in the future. An example is a teacher who gives students 5 minutes of extra recess who get 100% on their weekly spelling test. If a student gets 100%, they get the reinforcement, the positive reinforcement of an extra 5 minutes of recess. If that's pleasant to the student, then obviously the student is likely to do that again in the future to get that same kind of reinforcement. The second term is negative reinforcement. Negative reinforcement is the removal of an aversive stimulus based on a response which works to again increase the probability that the response will occur again in the future. In plain language, that means the student does something, the teacher removes something, again an object, activity, attention, etc., that the student doesn't like, and the student is likely to respond the same way in the future. For example, think of a volleyball class in PE, a middle school volleyball class, and students who are playing the game and serving the ball over the net to the other team. If you have a student who's not very athletic, who cannot serve the ball over the net, what happens when that happens, when the student can't serve the ball over the net, is the teacher stops the class every time the student can't serve the ball over the net, therefore making everybody stop, stare, and look at the student. The teacher then goes over and provides help to the student to get the student to serve the ball over the net. But what's really at play here is that it is so uncomfortable for that student to be watched by everybody while he or she gets this little lesson on serving. Once the student gets the ball over the net, the teacher goes away and the game continues and the attention is turned from the student. So what's at play here is the aversive stimulus is all of this negative attention that's happening. And the reinforcement is once the student gets the target behavior, serving the ball over the net, the negative attention goes away and the student is allowed to continue on as normal. If you can't tell, this is a personal situation that has happened to me. The third term is punishment. Punishment is the delivery, again, of a stimulus based on a response which works to decrease the probability that the response will occur again in the future. Punishment and negative reinforcement are not the same thing. Negative reinforcement is used actually to increase student behavior, and punishment is used to decrease student behavior. An example of punishment is a student cheats on a test and the teacher makes the student write, "I will not cheat 100 times on the blackboard." And then obviously the student is less likely to cheat again in the future because the consequence was this negative thing that happened. For the purpose of this tutorial, we're going to look primarily at positive reinforcement because this is what you will have to consider when you're writing your instructional plans. We're going to clarify two additional terms. We will interchange the phrase reinforcement, or the word reinforcement, and reinforcer. Reinforcement describes the relationship between a behavior and a consequence, whether the behavior increases or decreases a response. So that's what reinforcement is. A reinforcer is the consequent event itself. Candy, if students like it, is a reinforcer. Free time is a reinforcer. Tokens are reinforcers. So just to clarify those terms. There are 3 golden rules of reinforcement. The first one is reinforcers must be truly reinforcing, meaning preferred or liked to the students. An example of this rule being broken is pretend like the teacher gives students a sticker every time they turn their homework in. Well, this might be fabulous to certain students that like stickers, but if a student doesn't particularly care for it, then it's unlikely that that little system there of giving a sticker is really going to cause the student to want to turn his or her homework in. The second rule is that the presentation of the reinforcer must be contingent. This means based on the student's behavior. The student must receive the reinforcer only after performing the target behavior. Put this in the context of a scenario of a mother trying to get her child to clean her room, and she threatens the child and says, you can have ice cream, but only after you clean your room. And so her child goes and maybe makes a half-hearted attempt at cleaning the room or doesn't clean the room at all. But yet the mother feels sorry for her child and gives her ice cream anyway. This would be an example of this not being a way to reinforce, because the reinforcer that was given, the ice cream, was not based on anything that the student did. The third rule of reinforcement is that the presentation of the reinforcer must happen immediately after the target behavior is performed. There's a nice example in your Alberto and Troutman book about a teacher who is asking students to accumulate ceremony points in order to get a pizza party on Friday afternoon. And the students work really hard and they accumulate enough points by maybe Thursday afternoon or Friday morning. And so they've earned the reinforcer of a pizza party, but because it's happened early, there's all of this time in between where they can act up and get in trouble and exhibit all kinds of inappropriate behavior, and yet they still get the pizza party because they hit the mark as far as the number of points accumulated. But in this case, it's confusing because the reinforcement is not coming after the appropriate behavior has been performed. It's coming way after the fact, and therefore all other kinds of behavior can get in and cloudy up the situation. For more information on the golden rules of reinforcement, you could turn to Alberto and Troutman, Chapter 7, pages 285 to 290. There are different types of reinforcers. The first type is primary reinforcers, and these are reinforcers that have biological importance to the individual. They do not have to be learned for the reinforcing properties. We are sort of wired to know that they are. Examples are food, drink, sleep, shelter, and sensory input. Secondary reinforcers are reinforcers that are initially neutral, but they acquire reinforcing qualities through experience or learning. Examples of this are praise, tokens, activities, money, different objects. There's a very nice table on page 283. It's labeled as Table 7.1 in your Alberto and Troutman book that has a comprehensive list of primary and secondary reinforcers. The authors caution that this is not a continuum, with primary reinforcers being sort of low-level, bad kinds of reinforcers to use, and secondary reinforcers being better. That's not the case. They do maintain that choosing reinforcers must be based on the student's age, target behavior, and the setting. And so, for example, a student who is at a job site working on paper shredding or folding towels or cleaning rooms or what have you, for that particular student in that situation, a snack, something edible, or a drink in the break room might be an appropriate kind of thing for that adult at the job site because of the age and the situation and the context that's happening. We're going to turn now to schedules of reinforcement. We've talked about positive reinforcement and different kinds of reinforcers. Now we're going to talk about the schedule. Schedules of reinforcement are patterns of timing for the delivery of reinforcers. The timing of these reinforcers affects how quickly the target behavior is learned and how the behavior is maintained over time. In the next slide, you will see sort of a flow chart or an overview of the types of reinforcement schedules. There are two basic types. The first type is continuous, and the second type is intermittent. Under intermittent, there are actually two types of intermittent schedules. There are intermittent ratio schedules and intermittent duration schedules. And then under those two, there are fixed ratio and variable ratio schedules and fixed duration and variable duration schedules. So we're going to talk about each of those. This is just to give you an overview of how the subsequent slides are going to move. If you look, the figure actually moves from the top to the bottom, the top having more robust, intensive kinds of reinforcement schedules, and it moves on down to the bottom where there are less robust and intensive kinds of schedules. So we'll talk about that as well. Let's look first at a continuous reinforcement schedule. This is simply each time a student produces the target response, the student immediately receives the reinforcer. So every time the student tells time it correctly, he gets a piece of candy, or he gets verbal praise, or he gets a token to exchange for something else at the end of the week. Situations in which the schedule is used are typically when students are first learning the target response, and when the target response is one that has a distinct beginning and end, telling time, answering multiplication tables, wiping a table, identifying a sight word. Some considerations when using this schedule, though, is that the student might grow tired of the reinforcer and no longer be motivated to work for it because it's being offered so frequently. This is referred to as satiation, so that is a drawback. Another consideration is the target behavior may not be maintained over time if the reinforcement schedule is terminated once the target behavior is acquired. So if a student goes from receiving candy every time he or she does a response to then once the response is acquired, then the teacher doesn't reinforce at all anymore, it's highly likely that the student is not going to perform the response because that expectancy that I get something for doing this has been set up so strongly. So the next general kind of reinforcement schedule is an intermittent reinforcement schedule. This is when the reinforcement follows some, but not all of the student's performance of the target behavior. It's present, but it's not present after every single one. The situations in which this schedule is used are typically once the students have acquired the target behavior, and they're used to bridge the gap between a continuous reinforcement schedule and the complete fading of reinforcement, or the fading of reinforcement to natural reinforcers in the environment. If you go back to the flow sheet, what we're going to do is look at the intermittent schedule and now discuss two types. There's an intermittent ratio schedule in which the student is reinforced for the number of times a target behavior occurs. Situations in which this schedule is used is for target behaviors that have a distinct beginning and end, in which the overall instructional goal is to increase the frequency which with the target behavior is exhibited. We're going to look at some examples in just a minute. There are two types of ratio schedules. The first one is a fixed ratio schedule, and the second one is a variable ratio schedule. The fixed ratio schedule is the student is reinforced upon the completion of a specific number of correct responses. Let's go back to the telling time example. Instead of being reinforced every time the student tells time correctly, maybe the student is reinforced every 5 times the student tells time. So in a fixed ratio schedule, every 5 times the student tells time correctly, the student is given a reinforcer. Candy, praise, token, whatever has been determined. So that's the fixed ratio schedule. A variable ratio schedule has the student being reinforced upon the completion of an average number of correct responses. So going back to our example, maybe 5 is chosen as the average, but we're not going to hit a hard and fast 5 every time. We're going to maybe reinforce the first time every 3 responses, then every 6 responses, then every 4 responses, then every 5 responses, then every 6 responses. This keeps the student expecting reinforcement, but yet is not as hard and fast as the fixed ratio schedule, and therefore not as predictable, which actually works to increase student participation because they don't know when reinforcement exactly is going to come. The second type of intermittent schedule is a duration schedule. And this is when the student is reinforced for the occurrence of the target behavior for a certain amount of time. The situations in which this is used is for target behaviors in which the overall instructional goal is to increase the amount of time the behaviors are exhibited. So behaviors in which you might be taking data on duration are really good for this kind of schedule. Time on task, or time spent doing a job, or time spent running, engaging in a certain continuous kind of behavior. Again, like the ratio schedule, there are two types of duration schedule. The first one is fixed, and this is when the student is reinforced following the exhibition of the targeted behavior for a specific amount of time. The time could be in minutes or it could be in seconds. So the student is going to get reinforced for every 5 minutes he or she stays on task. Student stays on task for 5 minutes, reinforcement given. Student stays on task for another 5 minutes, reinforcement given, and so on. With a variable duration schedule, the student's reinforced following the exhibition of the target behavior for an average of a specified amount of time. So maybe the average amount of time is 5 minutes again to stay on task, but we're going to reinforce for 4 minutes, and then the student stays on task for 6 minutes, and we're going to reinforce, then 5 minutes, then 3 minutes, and again, it's not as predictable as the fixed ratio schedule, and therefore the students know that they're going to be reinforced, but it's harder to predict when, and that usually helps the students perform and continue performing the behavior over time. Now, the next thing we're going to talk about is fading of reinforcement. This is also called schedule thinning. And although we know that reinforcement schedules work to increase the student's exhibition of the target behavior, we must give consideration to how we're going to fade this reinforcement so the student can perform the target behavior either without reinforcement or under the control of natural reinforcers in the environment. The first step in this process is to determine the performance criteria for the target behavior that would facilitate a movement to a less robust reinforcement schedule. Oftentimes we can find this criteria in the goal that we've determined for our instructional program, the performance objective. So perhaps the goal is to answer questions regarding time to the 5-minute interval, 8 out of 10 daily trials, 3 out of 4 days. A teacher who is interested in reinforcing and thinning that reinforcement schedule might use that goal as her benchmark to sort of move down the reinforcement schedule. So let's look at the next slide and we'll talk about how this example might come into play. The final slide shows a fading of reinforcement flow chart, and this shows how reinforcement is faded over time. Obviously, if one started with a continuous reinforcement schedule, the next step would be to move to an intermittent, and one would have to choose whether that would be a ratio or a duration schedule. Once that's chosen, then let's take a ratio schedule. The teacher would first do a fixed ratio schedule, and then a variable ratio schedule, and then finally no reinforcement would be provided. So let's look at the example of telling time. We have a target behavior of answer questions regarding time to the 5-minute interval, 8 out of 10 daily trials, 3 out of 4 days. Pretend like the teacher started with a continuous reinforcement schedule, and that doesn't always have to happen, but let's just start at the top. So the student is being reinforced every single time he is performing that skill. Once he meets criteria, so he's told time correctly, 8 out of 10 trials, 3 out of 4 days, now the teacher might move to an intermittent, and she's going to move to an intermittent ratio schedule because this is something that is based on frequency. And so pretend like maybe the first time she's going to reinforce now, instead of every time, she's going to reinforce every 3 times. Our student meets criteria, and now the teacher's going to increase it a little bit. She's still going to stay on the fixed ratio, but she's going to reinforce every 5 times the student tells time correctly. Student meets criteria. Now the teacher is going to move to a variable ratio schedule, and she's also going to up the amount of the number of average times. So maybe her average is going to be every 8 times. So around every 8 times. It could be every 7, every 5, every 6, every 9. She's going to reinforce. And once the student meets criteria there, then she's going to take the reinforcement away altogether.